And most of you actually did submit, and I hope the others will do so shortly. And I would say that having done that, I think that really the major intellectual task of this semester, you've more or less carried it out. And so that's a big achievement in terms of getting through this course. Um, Now, the paper will be marked and it will be given back to you, but I think having taken the raw material, the answers to the 11 questions, and put them into some form of an essay, um, that even before the marker gets back to you with your grade, um, take a week, 10 days, and don't look at the what you've done, this first draft. But I would suggest that uh, you should, even before the grade comes back, take a look at your work and begin the final editing, which is actually quite a good deal easier than actually writing the first draft. The first draft is the really hard part, and in a way, editing the final draft is there's a certain pleasure in that. Sort of perfecting the language and changing things around and so on. When you go back to it after, say, a week or 10 days, it has a kind of fresh appearance. So, you'll be able to sort of get a sense of what you've done and start to improve it. And so, the whole point of this exercise is basically to help you to produce as finished an essay, short essay as possible. And once having done that, and you see this work and it's well written, well set up piece of work, you will have done that. You were able to sort of really compose an essay and put things together and think things out. And so that you can, having done this once, you can always do it again. You can do it again right through your other courses, through your university career, and of course, beyond that, because in terms of jobs in this world, administrative jobs, whether they're in business or in government or whatever, um, being able to write, being able to do some research and putting things together is one of the essential skills that you can that you must have. And if you do have that skill, it's going to take you it's going to qualify you um, to get decent, hopefully decent work. So we'll see. But nevertheless, that's the point of what you've been doing. So now, today, I want to do two things. I'm going to deal with England and the dramatic things that happened in England from the late 16th century onwards through the what we call the English Revolution, and then we'll turn to the Ottomans. We'll turn to the Middle East and to the Ottoman Empire. That's our new big subject, and so on. We'll go to visit India and then China, and then sort of bring things together and talk about what happens to Africa in the 18th century and so on, and then finishing things off with the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. So let's begin with England. And you will recall that um, England won this stunning victory over Spain in 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And this is under Elizabeth I, and For England, this was a real breakthrough. They had defied the great Habsburg Empire, Philip II, the forces of the Counter-Reformation, affirmed the independence of England as a sovereign state. And as I had explained, the power of the English Navy reflected not only a superiority from the point of view of naval warfare, but behind that was the growing, emerging economic strength of England as a country by the end of the 16th century. England had the most balanced sort of capitalist economy, and this reflected itself in its growing military and political power. And so we have to sort of understand a little bit more deeply the development of English capitalism. And I think you have some sense of that already from answering the questions that were part of the sort of essay assignment, the whole development of capitalism. You have some understanding of what capitalism was all about. And from a social point of view, who were the capitalists? Okay, well, obviously there were merchants who were capitalists. They were interested in accumulating money as much as possible. That's certainly true, but also you have to understand that in the countryside, and that's where capitalism really, especially in England, was really gaining strength. There were these wealthy farmers, these capitalist farmers. Some of them actually owned their land outright, and others were renting land from big landlords. They were tenant farmers, prosperous tenant farmers, or some of them were actually rich peasant proprietors. They actually owned their land. This was the heart of the capitalist class in England. These rich, but also these rich farmers. But alongside them, there were also, as this agricultural capitalism got going, there began alongside it, in the countryside, there developed manufacturing, rural manufacturing, iron and steel making, coal mining, tin mining, lead mining, iron foundries, steel fabricators, beer manufacturers. There's a whole host of new manufacturing industries that develop in England that sort of emerge in a coexistent way. And the manufacturing sector in the countryside and the agricultural sector reinforce one another in the 16th century. There's a kind of real takeoff of both manufacturing and agricultural capitalism in the 16th century. So there are the rich farmers, there are these manufacturers, there are the big merchants in the towns, and I would say also we should include some of the nobility, especially the lesser noblemen, the ones who didn't have big aristocratic titles sitting in the House of Lords, but they were the younger sons or the cousins of the big aristocrats, but they also became involved in business in the 16th century and forward. So that was what I would describe as the sort of emerging capitalist class in England, this new rising middle class, as we call it, the rising middle class, as against the old big landlord class, which also would include the big clergy, the bishops, those who had controlled the monasteries. These were the biggest sort of landlords in England, but they were an older class. They lived off rents. The capitalist class that I'm talking about lived off profits. They dealt in the marketplace. They were buying and selling land manufactured goods, commodities of all sorts. It was a different way of life. It was a market-oriented economy that they were developing out of. Now, what we see is that as this class began to get stronger and stronger in the 16th century, they began to challenge the political and social influence of the old big landlords, the church and the churchmen and the big nobles who lived off rents. And they also began to challenge, as you'll see, the power of the monarchy itself. The monarchy itself, I don't want to exaggerate at the beginning, but this new class had attitudes, had a mentality, were active in various economic ways that began to sort of collide with the old establishment, the old political and social establishment. Now, this struggle, it did begin to express itself, and it began to express itself in particular as a kind of friction that began to develop between the parliament and the king, the parliament and the monarchy. I should say queen, because the latter part of the 16th century, Elizabeth is on the throne and so on, and she's a very powerful ruler. And people, as her reign continued, she became more and more, she became stronger and increasingly popular as she was successful. She was increasingly successful, and so people respected her, they loved her, and she had a huge reservoir of popular support. But at the same time, this kind of friction, as I'm talking about, began to develop between the parliament as an institution and the monarchy. Now, to understand this a little bit better, we have to go back to the reign of her father, Henry VIII, in the first part of the 16th century. And as you know, the major event of his reign was the break with Rome, the secession of the English in the 1530s. England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, and Henry VIII made himself not only the head of the state, but basically the head of the church as well. The English monarch, to this day, is the head of the Anglican Church. Now, in order to do this, this was a break with England had been converted to Catholicism way back in the 6th century AD. The Pope sent missionaries into England, and England was converted to the Roman Catholic faith back in the 6th century, and it had remained loyal to Rome all through this period. So this was a revolutionary act on the part of Henry VIII, and he needed support in order to do this. He needed to be backed by public opinion, particularly the influential public opinion. I'm not talking about Joe Peasant here. I'm talking about big landlords or big merchants. They needed, Henry VIII needed their support. And the way he got that support was precisely through the English Parliament, through the House of Lords and the House of Commons, these two chambers of the Parliament. This institution, which was already, it had existed for 2 centuries, and it had become customary for the English kings to, when they passed important laws, statutes, they went to the Parliament. And when they were raising money to make war and so on, they went to the Parliament. It was a custom already. And all of this was now confirmed very strongly under Henry VIII, because the basic statutes that implemented the Protestant Reformation in England were all passed through the English Parliament, reinforcing the power of the monarchy. So he was using the Parliament. Moreover, he was at war with Charles V and so on, and he needed money for the Navy, and he relied on particularly the House of Commons to vote taxes to support these wars. The merchant class supported the wars because they were helping the English economy. So under Henry VIII, the Parliament begins to take on a sort of strong institutional role, and that role was confirmed under his daughter Elizabeth, because she too, every important measure she did, she took, and the taxes necessary to run the state and to run the military, it all came through the Parliament. So Parliament, in the course of the 16th century, unlike in France or Spain, where these kinds of representative institutions withered, in England they got stronger and stronger in the 16th century. So there was this Parliament, which was getting stronger under Elizabeth. And of course, it was made up of the two chambers, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The House of Lords were made up of, obviously, the biggest landlords in England sat in the House of Commons. The big dukes, the earls, the big nobles sat in the House of Lords. And then the House of Commons was made up of what I would call the most important merchants and what we call gentry, the lesser nobility. It was not about, this was not a democratic state. Democracy didn't, in the sense that we use it commonly in Canada, didn't arrive in England until the late 19th century. No, this was a state controlled by wealthy people. And the House of Commons was composed of wealthy people. But they were not great lords. They were not spiritual lords or lay lords. They were merchants and lesser gentry. And I explained that some of these lesser noblemen were also in business in the countryside. So the role of the Parliament is affirmed under the Tudors, especially Henry VIII and Elizabeth. And because it is meeting very frequently, it's called virtually every year to assist the king or the queen in public business. It begins to develop a kind of sort of internal organization, a system of committees begin to emerge. There are recognized leaders and spokesmen, and the House of Commons gets certain privileges in terms of the right to sort of freely express one's opinion in the Parliament. There's a certain tradition of sort of free speech in the Parliament and so on. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's beginning to develop a certain political capacity, the House of Commons, always under the monarchy. That being said, you do begin to see that in the course, even of the reign of Elizabeth, that some members of the House of Commons, in the course of sort of exercising their freedom of speech, will say something like, why are we getting close to the French? The French are our enemies. We should not have an alliance with the French against the Spaniards. We don't need the French, and so on. In other words, this member of Parliament is saying he's interfering in basically the realm of foreign policy, which the House of Parliament never did before. Suddenly, there's a member of Parliament who's questioning the foreign policy of the Queen. And there are these various incidents that happen under her, she becomes furious at some of these upstarts who are daring to question the royal policy. likewise, you see some members saying, "Well, the Queen is building a new palace up the Thames River, and so on. This seems to be a waste of money." Somebody will say, some member of the House of Commons will, and we vote the taxes, so no, she shouldn't do this, or this is, or her ministers are wasting money. Again, this is considered by her to be an interference. And like finally, another area where there is growing friction is in the realm of religion. In the realm of religion. And why is this? Well, Elizabeth has confirmed the Reformation. Uh, she is she rejects, of course, Roman Catholicism. They're at war. England is almost is at war against Spain, which is and the Pope, the embodiments of Catholicism, and so on. The English Church um, has absorbed the theology of Calvin, but the English Church is a traditional church too, because, for example, there are candles that are lit during the various religious ceremonies. The priests who administer in the church, they preach the gospel, they teach the biblical teaching as Calvin would like it, but at the same time, they say the Mass in a way that is very reminiscent of the Roman Catholic Church. And the stained glass windows, that's a throwback to the with the saints and so on, and these miracles, and that's also a vestige. And they use this incense in the church and so on. And some members of Parliament who are Calvinists, indeed more and more of them are Calvinists, they say, no, this is wrong. They get up and say, no, this is wrong. We need a full reform of the church. We have to get rid of all of these Catholic remnants in the church. We have to eliminate any vestige, and we have to, the churches have to be purified. And indeed, they even go further. They say, there's too much corruption in society. We have to live the way the Puritans down in Geneva live, in a completely sort of puritanical way. No more gambling, no more there's fancy dresses and so on. No, we should live in all of England. All of England should be purified in this way. I've explained the Puritan ethic. In other words, these people are expressing all these ideas which are basically challenging the old establishment. There is this incipient. At the same time, of course, they're all facing the possibility that Spain could invade, the Queen could be overthrown, and the Roman Catholic religion restored. So they don't go too far. And the Queen, she ends her life in a blaze of glory. She dies in 1603 and so on, and much revered by the population. But of course, she had never married, and she never married for basically political reasons. If she married, her power would be in some way jeopardized, and so in order to exercise full power, she remained unmarried, and so she didn't have any children, no heirs, and so as a result, when she died in 1603, her nearest relative was the King of Scotland. The King of Scotland, which was an independent kingdom. For the North, Scotland was independent. And there, the reigning family were known as the Stuart family, and James I was the reigning King of Scotland. And he became James I of England. He became King of England, as well as being King of Scotland, and they were two independent kingdoms. He ruled one separately from the other. He came down from Edinburgh to London to rule, but the whole sort of state apparatus in Scotland remained quite independent. But in any case, the whole atmosphere changed under James I because instead of cooperating, we see that conflict breaks into the open between the Parliament, and especially the House of Commons, and James I, the Stuart King. A whole series of clashes developed between the Parliament and the King. And they clash over foreign policy. Should we continue the war against Spain? Should we ally with France? James wants to conciliate the powers on the continent. The Parliament is militant. No, we want to carry on the war and defeat these Catholic powers and fight the Pope to the end, and so on. This kind of conflict over foreign policy. They more and more members get up and say, we want to purify the English Church, away with these Catholic vestiges. And we want, in particular, they say, we want to get rid of the bishops in the English Church. The Bible doesn't have any bishops in it, and so we shouldn't have any bishops, any hierarchy in the church. James responds, no bishop, no king. No bishop, no king. In other words, a hierarchy in the church is an important support to the hierarchy in the state and society. So the church becomes a real issue. Foreign policy is an issue. The members of Parliament begin to say that James, the court of James, is increasingly corrupt and decadent. There are all sorts of shenanigans going in. The aristocrats in the court are carrying on. There's all sorts of scandals in the court during the reign of James I. So they criticize, just like you see the criticisms of the royal family today. It was much worse back then. So there's that. And finally, James, he needs taxes, and Parliament begin to refuse his tax measures. Finally, there does begin to develop growing demands in the Parliament for what the parliamentarians say towards a more market-oriented economy. The king has too much power to fix prices. The king has too much power to control exports and imports. The king is interfering in the whole process of developing a capitalist agriculture. The king is even instituting monopolies. His favorites, some merchants who pay him bribes, are given sort of monopolies over certain economic activities. This isn't right. The economy works better if we have free trade, if we have open markets, and so on. So you see that even the economic dimension, there is this conflict. Well, all of this continues between 1603 and 1625. James, he finally expires and is succeeded by his son, Charles I. And with Charles I, this rift that has developed under James becomes an open break between the Parliament and the king. An open break develops between the monarchy and the king. And between 1625 and 1628, Charles Stuart calls 3 parliaments. He orders 3 elections. Only people with wealth can vote in these elections, but there are 3 elections. And each of the parliaments that are elected is more radical than the previous one. And the parliamentarians, all of the sort of grievances that I've listed are intensified. The matter of the church, the matter of voting taxes, foreign policy, the behavior of the court, all of these are issues. Charles, he is so frustrated by the obduracy, the stubbornness of the parliament that in 1628 he sends the last of these parliaments packing, orders them to dissolve, and he basically tells his counselors, listen, I'm not going to call elections anymore. I'm going to rule independently of Parliament. Forget about Parliament. We're going to carry on the government like Richelieu or like the Habsburgs carry on the government. We're going to institute an absolute government in England. Forget about parliamentary and constitutional norms. We're going to try and institute an absolute government, which is better, is more efficient, and so on. And so between 1628 and 1640, Charles calls no parliament. And he takes a series of steps, so I'm not going to go into detail, which basically are moving England in the direction of royal absolutism, as practiced in France and Spain. And any objections, and we do have, by this point, we have a public opinion. We have the beginnings of newspapers, pamphlets, and so on. There is a strict censorship imposed against any objection to this policy, which is called the policy of thorough, and when it comes to religion, Charles institutes a huge purge of anybody who is a Puritan, anybody in the church, any minister, any professor of theology who is professing this sort of puritanical policy is basically purged from the English church. So you do have, he begins to raise taxes, which is a very serious matter, without consulting Parliament. So it looks, by after 10 years, by 1638, it looks as though this policy has succeeded. He is creating basically the foundations of an absolute government, but he makes a mistake. Under the influence of some of his counselors, he decides, well, I've done this, I'm doing this in Ireland, England, by this point, Ireland is an English colony. I am instituting absolutism in England, and I'm going to do the same thing up in Scotland. Remember, Scotland is an independent state. And we're going to begin, in terms of dealing with Scotland, by basically, Scotland is a thoroughly Calvinist state by this point. The Genevan model that I spoke about, that is in place in Scotland. He says, we're going to get rid of this. And so he sends his representatives to Edinburgh, and they try to basically begin a purge of the Scottish church, of any of this puritanical influence. The Scots rebel. War breaks out between England and Scotland in 1638, and in 1640, the Scottish army invades the north of England, and Charles orders that the English army mobilize itself from the counties, the militias, because England has a kind of militia. It doesn't really have a standing army, as I've explained earlier. It orders the militias under the leadership of the leading aristocrats to mobilize and march northward to repel the Scots. And this English army does assemble, it begins to march north, but the army begins to talk amongst themselves, and they say, we're not going to follow this king. We're going home. We're not going to fight for this king. And they desert. The English army refuses to fight the Scots. The Scots occupy the north of England. This is in 1640. And Charles is helpless. And he can't do anything. The whole government is paralyzed. And in the counties, people are holding public meetings where they're defying the king. And so in this situation, he has no choice but to issue writs for a new election. After 12 years of no parliament, he calls for a new election of the parliament. And this parliament, which is elected in 1640, is a revolutionary parliament. It's a revolutionary parliament. The members are very radical. They are Puritans, and they, in terms of their religious attitudes, but also all of the grievances. And basically, their attitude is, we want a constitutional monarchy, away with absolutism. We're not going to accept that. And the result is that after 2 years, this is in 1640, by 1642, there's a complete breakdown in this relationship. The king actually, with a group of about 60 swordsmen, 60 courtiers, invades the House of Commons and tries to arrest the leaders of what he regards as a coup d'etat. And the leaders, they flee into the city, and the whole city of London basically revolts against the king. The king is forced to flee to Oxford. And open war breaks out between the supporters of the king and the supporters of the parliament. You have a revolutionary situation and a civil war revolution between 1642 and 1645. At the end of this, the parliament, which remember, the support of the parliament is this capitalist class, they are able to organize the revolutionary forces under a great general by the name of Oliver Cromwell, who is a Puritan. And this army marches singing hymns, gospel hymns, and so on. You have to understand that they're inspired by the Bible. And they rout the army of the king. The king is arrested and imprisoned. And ultimately, in 1649, Charles I loses his head. They chop off his head. England becomes a constitutional republic between 1649 and 1660. And this is now a republic. It's no longer a monarchy, just like Holland. And they institute a whole raft of changes. All of the things that I've talked about in terms of religion, in terms of the market economy, general comportment of the population, and so on, they basically institute a kind of rule of this Calvinist middle class over England. Now, this government, it lasts only until, because Oliver Cromwell becomes the head of this republic, it only lasts until the death of Cromwell, until 1660. But nevertheless, this is from 1640 until 1660, we can say England passed through a bourgeois revolution. A bourgeois revolution occurred. Just as we saw in Holland, the same thing happens in England. However, having said that, and like one of the key things that is instituted, for example, is basically absolute property rights. There is no longer any question. The parliament passes legislation. The courts accept the idea that individuals, and we're really talking about the capitalist class has there's no conditional right to property. property is vested in individuals and the government cannot interfere. Now, that is fundamental to a capitalist system. So, what I'm saying is that legally and politically, capitalism is institutionalized in Paris as a result of in England in the course of this revolution. Now, it doesn't last um, because, as it turns out, two things happen. First of all, the old ruling class, the old landlord class, they still have their properties, and they do not accept this upstart revolutionary regime. They refuse to accept it, and they do everything they can to overthrow it. But even more important is the fact that in the course of this upheaval, the common people are roused up. The parliament recruits armies from the ordinary people, lower middle class people, working people. And these people begin to get their own ideas about what politics should be all about. And their idea is what we call the principle of leveling. That was what it was called. And basically, the common people began to call for a democratic government. Now, that was a step too far. That was a step too far. Of course, the great landlords were appalled by this democratic movement. But also the rich merchants, the rich farmers, they didn't want the common people to vote. And so what I would say, the middle class was threatened by the upper class, but they were also threatened by the lower class. And the result was, after Cromwell died, they restored the king. They restored the king. But the kings, by 1688, and here we're coming to the end, had to accept that in the English state, it was the Parliament which especially the House of Commons, which reflected the views of the middle class, of the capitalist class, that this is where sovereignty existed. The monarchy remained, but the real power had shifted from the king and the monarchy. Ultimate power now lay with the parliament. England had become a constitutional monarchy as a result. And of course, I'm connecting that with the fact that capitalism had fully established itself in England by 1688. So I think I'll stop at that point and we'll then move on. We're moving to the Ottoman Empire next time.
Here, come on, sheet. Was it passed around?